When I tell this story, I always warn whoever's listening. Breathe slowly, because the heart remembers better that way. I'm telling you now because my hands don't shake as much, and my voice still knows where the emphasis belongs. I was young once. So young I thought the world fit into the palm of my future husband's hand. We married in Miami in 1995, when the city smelled of salt and gasoline and the promise of something bright on the horizon. It was a neon-sparked romance, the kind that plays over split-second looks and whispered plans between the clinks of ice in a cocktail glass. I loved him with a kind of clean hunger that felt like flying. I didn't know then that what flies fastest sometimes falls hardest. He had a laugh that could cut through a crowded room, and a suit tailored to make men notice, and women forgive. He called me his lighthouse and put flowers on the dashboard of the old Buick we shared. We pooled our lives like two small rivers joining into a promising current. Bank accounts, small apartment uptown, a piece of property my parents had helped us secure. He folded my name into his when he kissed my forehead. I signed papers with a tremor of excitement, not suspicion. In those days, I believed contracts were promises, and names on deeds meant something holy. I was an idealist with bills to pay, and a willingness to believe in the best of people. In his arms, I felt safe enough to be reckless. It took me a while to see the seams come loose. It always does, in little ways at first. An unpaid bill left for me to discover. A checkbook entry that didn't add up. A late-night phone call cut short when I walked into the room. Then one afternoon I found the deed. He said it was a business maneuver. Something about consolidation and legal protection that would benefit us both. His voice, which had once sounded like a harbor, slid through the explanation with the practiced ease of a man used to defending his territory with words. I believed him because the idea that he would steal from me seemed grotesque, impossible. Love policed my logic. They moved our joint accounts. They moved the title to our house. When I asked, he offered a line so smooth and practiced it could have been rehearsed for a courtroom. It's only paperwork, my amour. We still own this. We're in this together. He knew exactly which syllables would still the part of me that screamed. Love, I learned, is easily made to feel responsible for hush. He left a trail that read like a riddle. There's a particular kind of betrayal that is surgical. No yelling, no slamming doors. Just a quiet reconfiguration of accounts and titles while your trust drinks tea in the other room. He left one night with a cardboard box of shirts and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He called to say he needed space, which is sales speak for permission to commit something you will regret too late. He flew to Oklahoma City with a woman whose laugh he found more thrilling than the one he'd spent years growing used to. That's how he described her in our last exchange. She's exciting. Lois. Different. Different, apparently. Meant she also had fewer questions about tax loopholes and more patience for the long, slow art of starting over. When the papers finally hit my hands, copies I didn't know how to read in a way that would save me, I felt weight, not just legal weight, but the weight of time spent closing my eyes to things I didn't want to see. He had moved the property into his name, siphoned money into accounts that were no longer ours, and left me with a hollow that hummed. I remember the moment like a photograph left in the sun, the edges burned by silence, the center bright with a single blinding truth. The old Buick, the apartment with the balcony that looked over Biscayne Bay, our wedding picture on the mantel. Everything became evidence against a faith I'd misplaced. Love had not been a harbor. It had been a clever dock that let a man unload his cargo and sail away. People ask me how I survived the first weeks. You survive because there is no other option. You make lists. You eat things you didn't know you liked. You answer questions as if you are reading the script of a life you do not yet approve. Friends tried to be anchors. My sister fed me coffee and platitudes until I could hear better than to accept either. The city kept humming outside my windows. Tourists with cameras, men in loose Hawaiian shirts sipping espresso. the hum of a life that doesn't stop to witness your privatest grief. I walked down Ocean Drive and watched the sky hand its colors to the sea. I listened to the gulls and let their indifference do the work of truth-telling. The world keeps moving, not because it's heartless, but because grief needs a clock to measure itself against. The idea of revenge did not come to me as a movie montage. It was quieter, like the cold pressing of a thought until it took shape. It bored itself into me the way grief turns to calculation when the heart decides to be practical. I could have let lawyers fight, but I had been married to a man who had learned to manipulate the law like a magician, with sleight of hand. If I was going to get anything back, if I was going to reclaim even a sliver of dignity, I would have to learn the game on his terms. And so I turned my fury into a project. I began to read. I learned the language of finance the way a child learns to speak before they can read. Awkward, curious, and increasingly fluent. The first thing I did was inventory. Inventory is a humble but lethal tool. You name what you lost, and you keep naming it until you know the exact shape of your absence. I gathered every document I could. Bank statements, old letters, mortgage records, receipts for curtains and dishes he once said he loved. I pored over them under the kitchen light at night, my breath fogging like someone who still believed in miracles being discovered by moonlight. I found patterns. I found the accounts he'd opened under pet names. I found a trail of transfers that, with patience and a few calls to banks I'd never heard of, began to show an architecture. He had artfully built a nest of accounts and shell companies, each one a soft cushion to hide the real money. But shells break if you strike the right way. I learned the names of people who had helped him in the past. A broker with a taste for fast deals. A mortgage broker who loved the thrill of something that promised growth. A lawyer who offered silence like a paid service. Each name was a key, and I kept keys until I could tee up a door. I became very good at pretending to be someone I was not. A widow, a wealthy investor, a bored widow with time and curiosity. I called. I listened. I let them talk long enough to reveal where they hid their loyalties. Men love to talk for two reasons: to convince themselves and to find new friends. It was foolish of them to trust a woman who knew how to write checks and ask the right questions. Sometimes revenge requires money. I did not have the kind of money that changes legal systems overnight, but I had something harder to buy: resolve. I sold what little I could. Jewelry I'd worn to weddings that had happened before the theft of my future, and used the proceeds to hire someone who could read contracts like a man reads a menu. I found a paralegal who smelled of coffee and truth, and who had once been married to a lawyer who loved complexity. She taught me to read loopholes like necklaces, each clasp a danger. With her help, I began to assemble a case that was less about the romance of revenge and more about the arithmetic of justice. He thought he had made himself untouchable by moving to Oklahoma City. Maybe he believed that a Midwest town with its own rhythms could shelter him from the glare of my Miami sun. He was mistaken. People carry themselves across states like unchanging freight. Patterns don't change on a flight. Habits migrate. He still paid for things in ways that betrayed him, with the same credit card numbers tied to old accounts, with phone calls to the same broker he'd used in the past. It's curious how small men leave large fingerprints. He constructed his new life with the same tools: gifts, dinners, promises. Only now the audience was someone else. He began construction on a modest house outside of Oklahoma City, and boasted in the small bar where he liked to drink about a promotion that never existed. Gossip, I learned, is a slow and faithful servant. I took a job that gave me something else besides wages: a consistent schedule. Routine is the secret weapon of the patient. I taught bookkeeping at a community college. Nothing grand, just numbers and balance sheets and the way money tells the truth when given the chance. I taught students not because I needed the classroom, but because paper is blessedly honest in ways human hearts are not. At the end of each lecture, I would imagine the ledger of my life balanced in a way I had not yet achieved. Teaching steadied me and gave me a cover story. Who looks for revenge in an elderly woman who takes attendance and calls roll? The answer: almost no one. Then I began to build my legal case in earnest. I discovered that his transfer of property had been done in ways that, while technically legal at the moment, were morally crooked and susceptible to challenge. Property law is a maze of paper and timing. There are statutes of limitation and technicalities and human errors that make a clever schemer think himself immortal. He was not. The key lay in proving intent, that he had used fraud or undue influence to cause me to sign. That is a high bar, but not impossible. Lawyers are like cooks who have spent years learning to combine bitter herbs until the stew tastes right. With the paralegal's help, we mixed the right ingredients. Chronology, inconsistent statements, bank transfers that seemed to sprint away from his handwriting toward accounts held in the names of people who owed him favors. Patience was my ally. I photographed every document and had copies mailed to multiple locations. I interviewed witnesses, people who had been there when he encouraged me to sign papers, waiters who had seen him pay with checks that bounced the next day, neighbors who had observed odd hours. Witnesses are like mirrors. Sometimes they reflect a truth you didn't want to see, but often they break and reveal the sharp underside of a man's lies. It's astonishing, when you collect enough of them, how a personality begins to look like a crime scene. When the broker we had once used testified that he had assisted in moving funds in ways he now called questionable, I felt a peculiar lightness. The arc of the universe, I thought then, bends toward the small, stubborn acts of correctness. I still remember the first time I confronted him directly, after he'd been gone a year. He had not expected me to show up in Oklahoma City. Men who cheat on vows often assume the wounded party will wither or move on. They don't account for the kind of stubbornness that grows from ironclad hurt. I spoke into his face calmly, like someone reading a grocery list. I read to him line by line the transactions I had traced, the transfers, the shell accounts, and the back and forth that mapped his avarice. He laughed at first, the old laugh that had been my undoing. But laughter does not hold up under evidence. When I produced copies of his signatures, and the paralegal in the corner whom he recognized, his expression did something odd. It narrowed, like a camera focusing on a scene he did not want recorded. That confrontation had consequences. There's a small, almost medicinal satisfaction in watching a liar lose his composure. He flailed as men do, trying charm and then threat, and then pleading. He offered to settle, to sign papers to transfer things back in exchange for my silence. It was the same old pattern dressed in new fabric, but I had already learned a better posture. I would accept truth, not bargains sold in the language of convenience. He had made the bed. He would lie in it where witnesses could see him. When he refused to make amends, we pushed. We called auditors. We found a state attorney in Miami who had a reputation for not being bought. That man smelled of tobacco and conviction and took the case with a professional interest one doesn't often see in corruptible times. He told me plainly that the game would be long, expensive, and ugly. He said I might have to witness my own life be picked apart in courtrooms, that my private letters could be used as evidence and stripped of tenderness to mean something else. I understood the risk. There are times when justice asks you to expose things you would rather hide, to let your vulnerabilities be examined under harsh fluorescent lights, because the alternative is living in a world where people can steal with impunity. We filed suit. Legal battles are rituals of attrition. Papers accumulate in a way that becomes almost comical. Thousands of pages, each one a small army of phrases and signatures. We subpoenaed records, forced banks to reveal the connections he had thought invisible, and watched as the trail began to converge in ways that made his fraudulent structure unstable. He hired a defense. That surprised no one. Wrongdoing has a market. His girlfriend, who once seemed like the sun to his suddenly migratory soul, parted ways when the press discovered the story. People do not like scandal when it interrupts their vision of prosperity. She moved out as if she were being careful not to touch anything that might imprint guilt upon her. There were nights I would wake up and count the drafts under my door, imagining the files as soldiers marching toward a small victory. Occasionally, I woke to the sound of men in suits whispering downstairs, their cigarettes blooming shadows into the hallway. I made myself tea and read depositions in the thick hours before dawn, cup steaming like a small, faithful engine. Revenge had taught me to appreciate the quiet rituals of preparation. Early mornings, slow typing, legal arguments sharpened the way one sharpens knives before a harvest. As the case advanced, the press began to sniff. I had promised myself I'd keep things private. But the truth has a way of attracting light, and Miami loves light the way a moth loves a porch lamp. Reporters came, their questions artful and hungry. They wanted the drama. I gave them what I had, the timeline and the evidence, stripped of melodrama because the facts were cruel enough. The story became, for a moment, not about who I had been in love with, but about a system that allowed men to manipulate trust. I felt oddly proud, not because I'd become a cautionary tale, but because my small, stubborn voice seemed to help someone else avoid their own fate. People called with their own stories. Women who had been tidied out of their savings. Men who had been used as fronts. There is company in shared indignation. A solidarity that feels like sunlight through a cracked window. When the trial finally took place in Miami, the courtroom smelled like polished wood and old paper. I sat in the front row, my hands flat on my lap, and listened to the lawyers paint the picture of our life with the straight lines of fact. It is astonishing how intimate and public a trial makes you. Suddenly, the most private parts of your marriage become civic evidence. The defense tried to paint me as a woman who simply misunderstood financial instruments, an unfortunate spouse ill-equipped for the forces around her. It was an odious argument, meant to minimize my intelligence as if anger could be disarmed by pity. I had no interest in pity then. I had interest in consequence. We brought forward testimony from the broker who'd called our transfers a favor, and then, under oath, admitted to creating accounts that funneled money away from me. We showed altered records, signatures that looked like his but were affixed to documents he later claimed ignorance of. There were moments when the truth felt almost performative in its clarity. The jury, ordinary people plucked from ordinary lives, leaned forward like children learning an unkind lesson. He sat there with a face I recognized only as a mask. White, brittle, occasionally flushed with a color that betrayed his embarrassment. He was not the same man who had made me laugh on Biscayne Boulevard. Time and stress had eroded the ease he had perfected. The same ease that had made theft feel like a foresight. I watched his hands fidget in ways that would have once made me reach to calm them. Now I only watched, clinical and composed, as the portrait of a liar took form before everyone we had ever known. The verdict came down like a storm. Fraud, the judge read, and the restitution ordered was more than I could have hoped for. The courtroom erupted with the kind of noise that is both celebratory and exhausted. I remember thinking as people hugged and cameras clicked that the law can sometimes get close to justice, but never wear it like a coat. Justice is a drafty room with windows, and sometimes you stand in it and shiver, relieved and forever aware. He was sentenced to time. Prison is an ugly word with a soft logic to it. It is the state's insistence that certain breaks in trust deserve containment. I watched him led away and felt no glee. Revenge is not jubilation. It's the settling of a terrible, necessary account. I felt something like relief, a sense that the world had put a boundary around what he could do next. He had wrecked my life in small domestic ways, transferring accounts, changing signatures, so the punishment fit the crookedness of the crime. Afterward, life did not magically bloom like a film finale. There were consequences to a public conviction that reached beyond him. I had bruises that did not show on the skin, the quiet suspicion of new friendships, the way certain banks looked at me warily, and the difficulty of trusting that someone loved me for anything other than a retelling of this story. The Miami air didn't taste purer, although it seemed less toxic. I fell into a routine that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with repair. I volunteered at a shelter, taught a night class to adults trying to learn English and math, and took up a habit of walking along the bay at sunrise. I learned to enjoy small victories, a well-behaved student, a dinner that didn't require crisis management, the way a neighbor returned a favor without calculating a future advantage. Some nights, though, images return as vividly as if they were playing on the inside of my eyelids. The rustle of the deed signed in a place I had trusted, the hollowing sound of his footsteps down the hallway for the last time, the courtroom's hush as the verdict was read. Memory is not a single theater. It is several rooms that sometimes open without warning. I go into them not to dwell, but to remember how the architecture of my life shifted and how I rebuilt it. The rebuilding was not only legal. I cultivated friends who did not ask for anything and gave what they had without calculation. I planted a small garden on the balcony, parsley and thyme, herbs that will give you something even if you do not attend them perfectly. I learned how to cook the way my mother taught me, with patience and a stubborn sense that food can repair even when hands tremble. He wrote letters from prison. Of course he did. Men who do what he did often think remorse is a manuscript you can edit later. His letters were thin apologies stitched with self-pity. He confessed and then explained away his crimes as if reasons could be substitutes for remorse. I read them once and then did the sensible thing. I filed them away. I have always believed that a person's words matter less than their actions, and his actions had already proven their character. He paid his debt in a cage and a record. For me, the longer, truer payment was the labor of reclaiming myself. Years later, there was a hearing to determine financial restitution. The judge, a woman with a voice like a bell, read the order that required him to turn over assets that had been cleverly hidden. He had tried to erode the case, to move money into accounts across state lines, to convince others to hold assets for him, like gifts of trust. But the law has more patience than greed does, and the investigators we had hired found the fractures. Money crawled back to me in small, humiliating increments, checks and transfers that read like apologies in the language of currency. I used the funds to pay off debts that had been left in my name and to secure my small apartment with a new lock on the door and a better understanding of what trust means when the world is transactional. There are things you cannot reclaim with money. A season of faith that felt like an adolescence. A few relationships that frayed under the weight of scandal. The naive idea that love always saves you. But there are also things money cannot buy that I learned to grow inside myself. A quicker wit against charm. An appetite for truth instead of the easy comforts of denial. A satisfaction in knowing that I had not been a passive character in my own life. It's funny. People used to pity me for being a woman who had been cheated. Later, they congratulated me for seeking reparation. What they missed was that both pity and applause are external. The real work was internal and private. Revenge in the end is a tool. It must be wielded carefully, and only when there is no other clean way to reconstruct what was taken. I am older now, and the novas of my anger have softened into something like an ember. Warm, steady, and useful for lighting my path forward. I watch younger couples in parks, the ones who still believe in the sacraments of weddings. And sometimes my chest aches with the memory of my younger self, who believed in a man who could never be what I needed. But there's also a kindness in that ache because the same heart that loved so fiercely is the heart that learned to be fierce for itself. When the television news blares another story about trickery and greed, I feel a small surge of satisfaction that my case helped set a precedent. That someone who tried to hide behind legal maneuvers can be exposed. People think revenge leaves you empty. Sometimes it does. But when done for the right reasons, when it is a matter of insisting that wrongdoing have consequences, it can be a reclaiming rather than a hollowing out. My revenge was never about cruelty for its own sake. It was about insisting that a life not be erased by a man's greed. It was about making certain that the architecture of our day-to-day trust could not be rearranged by someone who treated marriage like a ledger to be exploited. When my grandchildren sit on my lap and ask me about love, I tell them the truth with the soft, blunt honesty of a woman who has been schooled by pain. Love is not a magic shield. Love will sometimes be accompanied by betrayal, but you can learn to defend yourself, your name, your assets, your dignity, without turning into the kind of person who causes harm. I teach them how to balance a checkbook like a small ritual of sovereignty. They giggle as I show them how numbers can be loyal friends if you feed them patience. I tell them stories of small kindnesses and the importance of asking questions before you sign away your life. There was a time in the middle of that upheaval when I thought I'd never lean into anything again. I imagined putting up walls so high I'd never enjoy the sun. But walls make prisons as well as protection. Instead, I made gates. Gates that have locks and keys and also windows. I allow myself to love, but with footnotes. I open my heart with recognition of risk and the humility to ask for proof. That may sound cynical to some, but I call it wisdom earned the difficult way. If you ask me whether revenge cured the sting entirely, I will tell you no. Recompense is not balm for all wounds, but it did something practical. It restored my financial standing, reasserted my dignity, and served as a warning to anyone who thought they could make a living from other people's love. There was a man who thought he could take a woman's life as easily as changing a title on paper. He learned, when the courts ruled and the law did its arc, that there are limits to that kind of greed. He learned, too late, that the human heart cannot be shelved. People write to me sometimes asking for advice on what to do when a partner betrays them. I tell them the same things I did to myself. Gather evidence, find someone who can read the language of contracts, use the law not as a weapon for revenge, but as a tool to clear the mess. I tell them to build a life outside of the story of their heartbreak. Teach, volunteer, plant things, and collect friends who will sit with you without running out of time or love. My own life's meaning was not solely restored in courtrooms. It was rebuilt in kitchens and classrooms and in the careful repair of daily rituals. There were quiet victories, too. Moments when strangers who had followed the case would come up to me in coffee shops and say, "You did well." That made me smile but didn't satisfy the deeper hunger. What satisfied me was the gradual retrieval of normalcy. I paid off the final debt left in my name on a cool spring morning, and then walked down to the bay to watch the city breathe. The water was a slow mirror of the sky, and a fishing boat drifted by, its anchor dipping like a heartbeat. I felt, for the first time in years, the relief of balance that is not tied to spreadsheets or court orders, but to the small, true rhythms of one human life continuing. Occasionally, I dream of him. He is never the same man in those dreams. Sometimes he is a child, sometimes a stranger. In one dream, he stands at a window, looking out over a city that is not his and cannot be stolen. He lifts his hands in a gesture of apology that is silent but palpable. The dream ends, not with reconciliation but with understanding. People will do what they do, and you are responsible for what you do next. That realization has carried me further than anger or sorrow ever could. If you are hearing this and you are young and in love, I ask you to take this small lesson. Love without giving away your name. Let your name stay rooted in whatever documents, accounts, or properties you share. Trust, yes, but with an account in your own name, a lock only you can open. This is not cynicism. It is prudence. The world offers both peril and promise, and prudence is the way to keep them both in view. There is a particular satisfaction that comes with maturity, the ability to tell your story cleanly, without embellishment, and to watch the younger faces folded into their own possibility. I tell you this not to warn you away from love, but to arm you with the knowledge that if love turns sour, You have tools. You can litigate, you can demand restitution, you can rebuild. You can do it all without allowing the bitterness to consume the rest of your life. Sometimes, late in the evening, I walk to the place where the sea light meets the shore. The city behind me sings with nightlife and traffic, and the ocean ahead is a slow, dark patience. I think of the house that was once in my name, how the deed used to hang like an invitation, and of the man who thought respect was optional and fidelity negotiable. I have loved since then. I have also been loved in ways that were honest and patient. I have watched my grandchildren learn to tie their shoes, struggle through multiplication tables, and kiss friends with the urgent tenderness of the young. They do not carry the weight of my history, and that is the most beautiful revenge of all. The future is clean in their hands. In the end, the story I tell is not merely about being betrayed and avenging that betrayal. It is about reclamation, the slow, meticulous reweaving of a life after it has been unraveled. I tell it because I want you to know that even when someone takes your house of paper, they cannot take your house of self-built habits unless you let them. I tell it because the city of Miami taught me how to survive, how to let heat and sunlight dry the small, bitter stains, and let the rest be compost for something that grows stronger and greener. If you come to my house now, and you are always welcome, you will find my parlor full of small things I have collected. Postcards from students, a faded photograph of that old Buick, a single rose pinned to a corkboard. I keep a copy of the court's decision in a drawer with my tax records. Sometimes I open it and read the paragraphs that set things right. It is not a trophy. It is a ledger balanced, a wrong made visible, and then accounted for. When I close the drawer, the light on the bay has usually shifted, promising another kind of day. I will tell you this finally, because perhaps you are waiting for a moral that will gloss everything smooth. Men like him can be dangerous, especially when the law is porous and love makes you blind. But danger does not mean helplessness. You can fight back. You can organize evidence and call on the people who will help you translate deceit into something the law will understand. You can do the slow thing, collect, wait, and then press. It is not always pretty. It is often lonely. But there is honor in insisting that the world not be permitted to reward theft. When I look at my life now, I do not see an old wound so much as a road map. I can trace the places where I fell and stood up again, and each scar is a signpost. There is dignity in survival. There is, too, a strange grace, the ability to say to someone who fears betrayal, "You will live." And I mean it. That knowledge has more power than any verdict. So if you want to know how this all ended, he paid. Not for me to gloat, but for the world to understand that promises written in houses and bank ledgers are not toys to be rearranged for a man's thrill. He learned that the law could follow him across states, that shell companies can be pierced by patient people, and that love, when mixed with prudence, forms a compound stronger than either alone. I walked away not with the revenge of a movie script, but with a steadier life and a quiet laugh at the audacity it took him to think he could take what belonged to us. Now, when the grandchildren ask for one of my stories before bed, I pick this one sometimes, not to scare them but to teach them gently that the world can be cruel and that the most important thing is to be ready when it is. I tuck them in, tell them about the bay and the relentless sun, about the way people can disappoint, and the way they can be made accountable. I end with the truth I have learned. The most powerful thing you can do when you are wronged is to get up and write an honest ledger of your life, and let the world balance itself under that truth. There are no fireworks as a curtain. Call, only the small satisfaction of order restored. I have had other loves since then, softer and less theatrical, and they have been kinder. I have learned to recognize a man's eyes when they mean what they say, and to walk away when they do not. I have taught my grandchildren how to spread butter on toast in slow motions that keep the bread whole. I have watched them grow. I have watched myself grow with them. If you remember nothing else from what I have told you, remember this. Guard your name. Guard your signatures. Love fully, but keep one hand on the ledger of your life. When the day comes that you must choose between silence and action, choose action. Not for vengeance alone, but to remap your world. You will find, as I did, that a life recalibrated is not only survivable, but, in time, brighter.